And good morning, everybody, on the Daybreak Show. I've got via Zoom video conference representing the 6th District of the great state of Washington, Representative Derek Kilmer. Hi, Derek. How are you doing?
Great to be with you, Jeff.
Good to talk with you as always here. And there's a lot going on in Washington. We have a lot to get to today. But first, let's look back at the life and legacy of a friend of yours in the House of Representatives, John Lewis. I know you have had the opportunity. You were able to walk with him over the Edmund Pettus Bridge a couple times. You have a story you can share about him that folks may not know, and then just overall his life.
I mean, it's always cool when you meet one of your heroes and they turn out even to be even more amazing than you thought they would be. And that was consistently my experience with Mr. Lewis. It's funny, throughout 8 years of being able to be his colleague, every time I talked to him, I would call him Mr. Lewis, and he would always say, "Eric, call me John." And I would say, "I can't." So, there are days in Congress where, when you have a bad day or when something goes wrong, every now and then you would lean over to a colleague and say, "You still get to work with John Lewis," which is not too shabby. But probably for me, the highlight of my relationship with him was getting to go to Selma. And last year I brought my daughter, Sophie, with me, and to walk across the Edmund Pettus Bridge with him, a place where 55 years earlier he'd been beaten and tear gassed, simply had his skull cracked open for advocating for the right of African Americans to vote in this country. And he was so great sharing stories with my daughter. And as we were wrapping up the trip, we were at the airport, and she said, "I got another question for you." And he said, "Go ahead." And she said, "Were you ever scared?" And he said, "To be honest, there were times I was scared, but I was strengthened by the fact that I knew there were a lot of people counting on me to stand up and to fight for justice." And, the very last time I heard his voice alive was we had a call early this summer, and it was after the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. And he called into a call with many members of Congress on it. And he said, "I'm sad because we're not as far on the path to justice as any of us want to be." But he said, "You know what? But I'm also hopeful because there's a whole bunch of young people in this country who are standing up and speaking up and demanding change. And that's how change happens in this country." So, and his last words to us were, "Keep your eyes on the prize." He will be terribly missed, not just by those of us who had the honor of getting to work with him. He'll be terribly missed, I think, by our country because he was just a very civil voice for change, for justice. He demonstrated that you could be powerful and peaceful at the same time, which I have a great appreciation for. And it was certainly a huge honor for me to have had the opportunity to work with him.
Switching gears to coronavirus, the $600 monthly pay or weekly payments by the feds is ending here in just a couple of days. I think the way Washington State worked, it actually ended a little earlier for folks here. I'm seeing some movement in the Senate. Obviously, the House had passed the CARES Act months ago, which addressed a lot of these issues, and there is starting to be talk in the Senate about a bill which looks drastically different than the HEROES bill, and I understand this would be their opening volley. But as tough as this situation is right now, I can't imagine there's a lot of time to be playing back and forth on this in conference committee. Where are you getting a sense that something is going to happen to help people out? I was talking with the city manager of Shelton, and he said, I think a great thing has been these $600 a week payments to help folks. The problem, though, is that I see is that when it ends, we're not going to know whether or not it was a benefit or not until maybe a month or two down the road. And by that time, we haven't been offering the additional payments. And it just seems pretty precarious right now.
Yeah, let me touch on that in a few ways. To me, I have a sense of urgency about this because I'm spending every day talking to folks who are really hurting right now, and it's not their fault. The people who've lost jobs as a consequence of this pandemic, it's not their fault. And when we get an email from someone saying I've lost my job and I don't know how I'm going to pay my bills, I'm not sending them a form letter. I'm calling them and talking to them and trying to figure out how we can help. And there are a lot of people who are really hurting right now. And I think part of the role of the federal government is not to say you're on your own, but to say we're going to help you. And that was really the rationale behind that federal support for unemployment assistance, to say that for the average unemployed worker, that on average they would see an unemployment check that was equal to the amount they made when they were working, so that they can continue to meet their financial obligations, that they can make rent or pay mortgages and put food on the table. And I am, and I don't say this in a partisan way, it's just a statement of fact. I am really concerned that the HEROES Act passed 10 weeks ago, and the Senate leadership, Senator McConnell, did nothing for 10 weeks in terms of any sort of coronavirus response. And he said, what's the hurry? Well, we've now found out what's the hurry when you see benefits expiring, and we're getting calls from people saying, what do I do? I think it's a terrible, terrible mistake to just pull the rug out from under people who are hurting through no fault of their own. On top of that, you saw a report from an economic think tank just this morning that said if this $600 expires, the impact to our economy is expected to be a loss of between 4 and 5 million more jobs lost. Simply because, and again, if you talk to local retailers, if you talk to anyone who's been able to figure out how to operate through the course of this, one of the things that's somewhat buoyed our economy is the fact that people still have at least some money coming in the door. And if that funding expires, the impact to our economy will be really significant. I think it's really unfortunate that the proposal that was put forward by Senate Republicans proposes cutting that amount of federal support by 2/3. Because here's what we know. People's rent payments aren't being reduced by 2/3. People's utility bills are not being reduced by 2/3. Their car payments are not being reduced by 2/3. Their cost of feeding their kids is not being reduced by 2/3. And so the rationale behind a cut of that magnitude is befuddling to me. I don't understand it, and I know that the consequences to the folks I represent will be really significant. So I'm pushing for a smarter approach. In fact, we're introducing a bill tomorrow that, rather than what often happens in Washington, D.C. is, Congress identifies a problem and they put a patch on it, and then, they have to put another patch on it a few weeks later. And what you've seen over the course of this pandemic, it's, sort of the scene from Jaws where Brody says, we're going to need a bigger boat. And that keeps playing out every few months because the size of the problem keeps outstripping the federal response. So the bill we're putting forward would maintain that federal support for unemployment assistance through the length of the pandemic, through the length of the national emergency. And then it would start to adjust the levels of support as the economy, as the state of the economy improves. So that once we see, and listen, right now you have literally tens of millions of people who are out of work, and many of those jobs aren't coming back. So it doesn't make sense to cut that benefit at this point when those jobs aren't coming back. At some point when the economy picks up, it may make sense to start, changing the levels that are provided to people, but certainly not right now.
When I look, and I heard a statistic about those who lost their job, and it was something about I don't know, like 60% or so weren't even sure their jobs would ever come back. So is this, as I'd like to switch gears to something in Washington, it's, wildfire season. Are there talks about reenacting the CCC, the Conservation Corps, to get people back on some sort of a job through the feds to go cut fire lines, or, do those types of jobs that we did, back after the Depression in the 20s. 100 years ago, we were sitting almost in this same exact position, and there were ways that we got out of it there. Are there those things that are happening, conversations at least in the Capitol about that?
Yeah, let me touch on that in a few different ways. The You actually saw something unique happen last week, and that was a bipartisan bill got passed and is about to be signed into law. It's a bill called the Great American Outdoors Act, and it is focused on providing jobs related to our outdoors. Addressing something you and I have talked about before, addressing what is a very significant maintenance backlog in our national park system, and providing funding for something called the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which in our state flows through something called the Recreation and Conservation Office, but is used to do things like build parks and build trails and protect working forests. And the combination of those two things could have a real benefit. I mean, listen, I grew up on the Olympic Peninsula. There wasn't a summer of my childhood that didn't involve going hiking in the Olympics or fishing with my dad and my brothers. And, those are experiences I've tried to share with my kiddos as well. But, as I got older and I worked in economic development professionally, one of the things I've realized is how important our parks and our public lands are to our outdoor recreation industry and to jobs. In our state, that industry supports about 200,000 jobs and contributes over $20 billion to our state's economy. And so, to the point of your question, there is a recognition that the value of making these investments is not just in terms of the environmental benefit of, I look at our national parks as kind of the crown jewels of our region. But they've gotten a little rusty, right? You've got, just in Olympic, you've got a pretty significant maintenance backlog with trails that have been washed out, roads that have been washed out, water systems and wastewater systems that are failing. And the idea here is that we can both address what is a critical need from an environmental standpoint, address something that could absolutely positively contribute to the tourism economy and the outdoor economy of our region, but also importantly, put people to work. I think about in the district I represent, that Land and Water Conservation Fund, the Blueberry Park project in Bremerton, Shane Park in Port Angeles, which is the park I played at when I was a little kid growing up in PA. And even though I consistently played for losing sports teams, I still love Shane Park. And I'm still a supporter of the Land and Water Conservation Fund, even though I was never on a winning sports team. So I think this is something that Democrats and Republicans actually agreed on. We're able to get that bill passed across the finish line. And I worked really hard on it. Our Senator Maria Cantwell really took a lead role in that as well. And it's to her credit that it got bipartisan support out of the Senate. And now is going to be a law that makes a real difference for regions like ours.
The Attorney General has been talking to the House Judiciary Committee for, I think, the first time he's been up there on the Hill in a long time. I know you're not on that committee, but do you have any thoughts about him in his office right now? Anything else that's been going on regarding the protests in Portland and the possibility of federal troops in Seattle and across the country?
Yeah, I guess a lot I could touch on there. I think there's a fundamental question. I haven't been able to watch the Judiciary Committee hearing. There is a fundamental question at play here, and that is, does the Attorney General work for the people of the United States of America, or is he the president's attorney? And I think there's concerns that I have that too often he seems to be acting in the political interest of the president rather than in the public interest of the American people. With regard to the issues around the protests, I look at things like the clearing of Lafayette Square in Washington D.C. for what was essentially a photo op. And to me, it's at cross purposes with First Amendment rights. And I agree with Admiral Mullen, who said, our communities are not battlefields to be dominated. There are neighborhoods and there are communities, and and there are homes. And so that's, I think, a concern that I and much of the Washington delegation have raised with the administration. Obviously, none of us want to see any violence in our communities, and at the same time, I'm concerned about having federal agents show up without identification, without having disclosed their credentials, detaining protesters, in many instances, detaining peaceful protesters without identifying themselves appropriately. And so there is legislation that has been introduced that's targeted at trying to protect peaceful protest and requiring that any sort of federal officials display official identification, disclose their credentials, and be limited to policing areas around federal properties, not unless they've been invited in by a mayor or by a governor.
U.S. Congressman Derek Kilmer is online at kilmer.house.gov. You can find more information from him there, newsletters, press on other things that he's been working on, and information on his office locations, both here in Washington and in D.C. You can always see him as well on, again, kilmer.house.gov. We'll put the links to that in the show notes. Derek, a lot going on right now, as always, and, I don't know what to tell you about your sports teams growing up. I can't give you much advice on that either, because I wasn't very good either. But it's fun. It's fun to talk with you and catch up on all these issues of the day. U.S. Congressman for the 6th District around the great state of Washington, Derek Kilmer. Thank you, sir.
You bet. Great to see you, Jeff. Thanks
Great
again.
to see you.